So, welcome to the CIVIS series on transdisciplinarity in education and research. It's lovely to see lots of you joining us today. Today, we're going to be listening to Professor Ria Dunkley from the University of Glasgow. It's an enormous pleasure for me to welcome Ria. We work together in Hub 1 of CIVIS. I've listened to Ria talk with me about what eco-pedagogy is before. It's been truly inspiring, and I know that this will be an inspiring talk. So, Ria, I welcome you warmly to the Transdisciplinary webinar series. I'm going to turn my own camera off. I'm going to be in the background, and if anything technical goes horribly wrong, I'll suddenly appear again. Welcome.
Thank you, Alistair. And thanks everyone for joining us this morning. So we're here to discuss, as Alistair said, eco-pedagogy, a way of rethinking education for resilience, trust and action in times of planetary change. And this again is feeling all too real this morning, as we've just had a kind of very stormy few days here in Scotland, and we're going to be facing these things with increasing frequency. So I want today to explore the eco-pedagogy in the context of this change, so in the context of the Anthropocene, which presents unique challenges for people like me, educators, but also opportunities in terms of thinking about how we could transform how we teach and engage and act. So let's dive straight into that. So first, I want to start by anchoring the discussion to introduce the concept of eco-pedagogy. So it's a framework that centers on addressing the challenges and opportunities of the Anthropocene. So it represents not just a response to the Anthropocene, but a reimagining of education itself, shifting from traditional modes of education to ones that are more rooted in environmental justice, in social justice, and in relationality. So in thinking about our relationships to the rest of the planet and to all other species on the planet, which is quite a different way of thinking about education. So at the core of eco-pedagogy builds on Paulo Freire's idea of conscientization and empowering learners to be critical analysts of systemic injustices. So it's both about the personal learning journey that an individual goes on, but very much rooted in that outside world, in the wider structures that are taking place. But Paulo Freire never really worked on the concept of the environment. Indeed, the challenges in his time were very much social challenges and questions of social justice. And so eco-pedagogy has been brought into a space of thinking about the environment by key scholars, many of whom are from the Global South originally, to extend Paulo Freire's ideas by integrating environmental justice into education and reflecting on the challenges in that context. It's also a concept that emphasizes trust. So thinking about trust between communities, between learners and educators, it plays with the hierarchies of traditional education. And I've found to draw on people like Bell Hooks, the scholar, to really think about power in the classroom and indeed outside the classroom, and how trust can be a foundation for systemic thinking and participatory action. So eco-pedagogy, it really kind of focuses on those things, but also on thinking about things in a systems perspective. So that idea, the Eames idea that eventually everything connects, that learners need to understand how the local connects to the global, and how that allows us to contemplate how we might actually be change agents in what is an enormous challenge in terms of climate change and the other issues that we're facing, like biodiversity loss, global inequalities, food insecurity, and the like. So in terms of thinking a little bit further about what we're aiming for in eco-pedagogy, it flips traditional education on its head in a lot of senses, in that it aims for transformation. So we have an approach that is actually aligning learning with action very explicitly. And for some educators, that's an uncomfortable space to be in. But it represents a paradigm shift in that sense, away from kind of traditional, maybe siloed education models. And it seeks to see education not just as mastery of subjects, but as relational and about encouraging collaboration and cohabitation of the planet, both human and non-human species. So participatory learning is a key part of this field. So thinking about real world examples of learning from things like urban rewilding, or learning about community energy through energy audits, or flood adaptation projects through actually doing the science of flood monitoring. To empower learners to actually think about how the challenges that we face can be addressed to foster resilience. And in essence, then, eco-pedagogy, it's more than a framework for environmental learning, but it's this call to action for planetary justice and to rethink interconnections. And it equips learners to navigate transformation in that sense. And so through this presentation, I'm going to return to this idea repeatedly as kind of a thread throughout. So think about how eco-pedagogy applies in times and in systems. But for now, I want to leave you with a key kind of question to keep in mind, which is, how can we reshape education at this moment that we're living through, so that it doesn't just describe the problems that we're living with to learners, but helps us thrive within the era that we now call the Anthropocene? So the next concept I wanted to touch on, which Alistair will be talking about in a lot of detail next week, is this concept of the Anthropocene. Being a social scientist, I come at it from the perspective of seeing it as both a scientific framework, but also a cultural tool. So firstly, the scientific concept anchors us in planetary scale changes, thinking about biodiversity loss, climate instability, and other defining shifts of the epoch. But beyond science, it also functions, as they say, as this kind of cultural and educational tool. It fosters transdisciplinary dialogue, as we're focused on in this seminar series, and systems thinking, which are essential for tackling complex global challenges. So I'm currently with Alistair and Kevin Noon undertaking a research project which involves interviewing academics to understand how the Anthropocene is considered, and to highlight the variations in disciplines and ways of framing it. And it's been a really fascinating process to think about the naming of the geological epoch, but what it means beyond the discipline of geology. So the interviewees so far have highlighted things that such as that the Anthropocene isn't about precise definitions to many people. It's about understanding this interconnected system and the scale of human impact on the planet. Other academics have noted how important it is to think about the Anthropocene as a boundary object, so a way of connecting disciplines that traditionally work in isolation. And that, for me, linked up very much to one of the key theorists that influences my work as an eco-pedagogue, which is Bruno Latour, who Bruno Latour critiqued the artificial separation between human and nature. And that's particularly relevant in the context of the Anthropocene. Indeed, it's something that he challenged us to think about in his later writings. And it brings us to this question as educators to think about how can education equip learners to address the rapid and unprecedented changes in the Anthropocene while also fostering hope and action. So for educators, the Anthropocene offers an opportunity to frame urgency, interconnectedness, and local empowerment. And in that sense, as a kind of eco-pedagogue, I find it a hugely helpful framework for bringing in discussions of why we need this kind of educational shift. So again, it goes beyond the kind of traditional environmental education approaches or education for sustainability approaches to really bring in the scientific basis for why we really need to think about education shifts more urgently. So it's about the idea that building trust amongst people can be a key element of thinking through the Anthropocene. And in trust and collaboration and empowerment are kind of key concepts that I want to focus on today in terms of taking meaningful action. So yeah. So, and another way that people are framing in the interviews that I'm doing the concept of the Anthropocene is of being a paradigm of rupture. So, thinking about this idea, which Clive Hamilton, I believe, originally suggested, it's to disrupt the planetary systems, the ecosystems, the societal structures, all of the ways that we live and interact in ways that the planet and indeed ourselves have never experienced before. So one participant captured it perfectly when they were saying that the rate of change in ecosystems and biosphere processes is unlike anything we've seen before. And because of that, it's not just about geology, it's about ecosystems changing rapidly. So this isn't just a geological concept, as I said, it's about cascading impacts of human activities on the systems that we depend on that have far-reaching consequences. And we can break this down into thinking about the crisis on three levels. So on one level, we have a planetary level, which is to think about sea level rises, increasing greenhouse gas emissions, for example. That's the terrestrial level, so to think about biodiversity collapse, habitat destruction, and ecosystems reaching critical tipping points. And then there's, of course, the societal level of the Anthropocene. So to think about globalization processes and inequalities, which are deepening and profoundly compounding the challenges that we face. So the interconnected pressures challenge us to think and rethink modernist narratives of progress. So whereas Bruno Latour would challenge us to say we have never been modern, and that the distinction between nature and culture and the idea that we've somehow gone beyond nature and left it behind and become cultural beings is a complete fallacy. And that has become blatantly apparent in this time of rupture of the Anthropocene. So it forces us to contemplate the interdependencies and the tipping points that we're facing on the planet. So we really need to embrace interconnectedness in education and to make that a kind of core concern through our transdisciplinary work. So it demands more now that we understand these things, understanding the building blocks of the environment or of the climate, but to think about how education helps us respond to these ruptures, again, in a way that doesn't overwhelm people, but fosters hope and resilience. So I want at this stage to think about the idea of connecting disciplines and connecting beyond academia, which is something that the Anthropocene can function as, but also to think about the challenges in this sense as well. So the Anthropocene as a concept, as I found in my interview processes, is not a concept without critiques. Some argue that it oversimplifies the responsibility by presenting humanity as a homogenous group, erasing the nuances of inequality. So people are advocating for other terms that you might be familiar with, like the Capitalocene. And so it doesn't say who is responsible, and that for some scholars, especially in the decolonizing spaces, is a key concern. And so we must, I feel, address that critique when we're using the term the Anthropocene in educational frameworks. But despite these challenges, the Anthropocene encourages us to embrace plural perspectives, I believe. So you can have this broad, all-encompassing term, and then to introduce these more nuanced ideas that maybe indigenous, feminist, and decolonial approaches encourages us to reframe and to think about processes of cohabitation on the planet, and to get away from this kind of one-directional human intervention approach to think about things in a more circular space. So feminist and decolonial perspectives expose the limitations of kind of dominant Western frameworks, of which Anthropocene thinking could be seen as one. But also the concept is useful, though not perfect. So the perspectives are central to thinking through the Anthropocene and eco-pedagogy, which I wanted to acknowledge. So for now, I'm not asking you to settle every critique on the Anthropocene in your minds, but to see the term as a starting point in terms of thinking about how we frame urgent questions about sustainability and inequality and interdependence by embracing this plural perspective and encouraging education potential and opening up new pathways for understanding our challenges. So this then, now that we've gone through the kind of theoretical part of things, I wanted to spend the rest of the presentation on thinking through what eco-pedagogy might look like in the Anthropocene. And there are three things that I'm coming to believe are absolutely central to an eco-pedagogy of the Anthropocene. So let's look at each of these a bit more closely. So first we have the idea of time literacy, which Alistair again is going to talk about in great depth next week, and I'm really looking forward to. The Anthropocene invites us to consider multiple timescales, from deep geological times that have shaped the planet to rapid human-driven changes that we can see today. And understanding timelines helps learners contextualize the unprecedented nature of this moment. So as I showed in the graphs on slide 5, being able to see things on that scale makes a difference. So, for example, when we're thinking about how the Earth's climate has fluctuated over millions of years, and the current rate of warming is unlike anything that we've seen in millions of years, then that can make a real impact on learners. Indeed, it was one of the key things that started my journey in terms of environmental education. And that's what makes the kind of concept of the Anthropocene so unique. It compresses the vast planetary changes into the span of centuries or even decades, depending on who you speak to. And people, I think getting this kind of knowledge, this ability to think through the past, present, and future is something that's perhaps not well developed in education currently. And so we need to think playfully about how we can help students to grasp the urgency of the action by reflecting on deep time. And by understanding how short-term decisions, things like thinking about fossil fuel use, deforestation, and the cascading events of that over decades and centuries and even longer. And that can really help learners appreciate the stakes that are involved in taking action in this epoch. So educational tools like, as I've said, the deep time graphs or climate data visualizations, things like the climate warming stripes, I find very effective when I'm speaking to teacher educators in this space. Those are the kind of things that maybe make things tangible and actionable and can be a crucial touch point in terms of the learning experience. Another thing that we really absolutely need to get through in terms of education is to think about the Anthropocene and how it helps us see the interconnections of planetary, social, and ecological systems. So there's been an argument from people like David Orr and many scholars now, indeed, I think it's quite widely appreciated that the problems that we face have a large part of them are due to the fact that we fail to see things as part of wider systems, as part of things that are connected. So climate change, for example, is not just about rising temperatures, it is about exacerbated biodiversity loss, food insecurity, water scarcity, and what some people are now calling the poly crisis as a way of working. So it gives us this the Anthropocene concept in itself gives us a kind of bird's eye view of system dynamics, especially when we're thinking about things like a polycrisis. And these perspectives allow us to connect our local actions, like maybe improving the soil and therefore influencing the food systems, to being a part of restoring ecosystems locally, to then thinking about how those things connect to global challenges like climate adaptation. And so for education specifically, systems thinking is about breaking down the silos of the disciplines. So students' projects might be kind of projects that involve thinking about a very tangible local issue and participating in some way and learning about all the different subjects in the context of that one space, so that it's not just about understanding, but it's about solving problems, seeing how things connect, and really taking a different approach to how we question things. The final aspect of eco-pedagogy in the Anthropocene is maybe the most challenging, which is the urgency to act. So in a lot of spaces when I speak to educators, this is often the most contested and difficult space for people, in that people worry about education being seen as too activist or not serious enough if we're encouraging action. But in the time of the Anthropocene, when we are facing such crises, we do also need to think about how education is serving learners. And so there are questions to think through about whether the time for action is here with a guided framework. So one of those guided frameworks would be to encourage learners to engage with real world challenges by tying learning to participatory projects and to experience how their actions can create meaningful change. So, for example, a lot of my work now focuses on urban sustainability and climate action. here in Glasgow. And we're actively focused on engaging community members with thinking about carbon sequestration, renewable energy provision, mapping trees and flooding and the like. And so we can think about how doing these practical projects can be part of the solution to create pathways for understanding and empowerment. And so to get together, these three themes for me at the moment are giving me a framework for educating in the Anthropocene and helping learners grasp the big picture, both the immediacy of this moment and its rooting in deep time, and our role as active agents within that space too. So the next thing that I wanted to just focus on is this connection of how you make the Anthropocene tangible to people, and to again focus on three key things of showing or demonstrating, witnessing in some kind of way how local action connects to the global, to amplify what's possible in local spaces, and then to act again. So the shift emphasizes the interconnection of the local and the global action here, highlighting how community-driven efforts can be critical to addressing systemic issues, is something that I feel very passionate about in terms of where to place efforts as an educator now, because the spaces in which we have the possibility to make change is indeed the present. So, for example, urban rewilding projects can restore city biodiversity whilst also contributing to these bigger picture global ecological resilience issues. So similarly, if we have local community energy projects like maybe solar cooperatives or efforts based on reducing emissions and empowering local groups to take ownership of energy futures, that can then contribute to the overall picture, a kind of national and international scales. And these initiatives kind of embody the Anthropocene's principles, Anthropocene eco-pedagogic principles of cohabitation and resilience, showing how local solutions can address global crises. So participatory learning is absolutely key in these spaces, to think about how we can interact with our local environments and take first-hand actions that fit into a broader system. So in one of my interviews with the Anthropocene scholars, they kind of recognize this in saying that whether or not the Anthropocene is recognized formally, as you might be aware of the debate around defining the Anthropocene, it's a concept that actually helps us to articulate the planetary emergency and connects us to action. So it gives us that impetus for delivering eco-pedagogy that thrives on the kind of interconnections at a global scale. So ultimately, making the Anthropocene tangible requires this demonstrating the power of the collective, the community-driven actions. The actions remind us that addressing planetary challenge starts with what we can do here and now, and always keeping that bigger picture in view. So I just wanted to touch on, just before showing you a practical project, some of the challenges that Anka focused on last week in terms of the communication space and how these interact with education too. So the Anthropocene brings kind of ecological, societal, and profound educational challenges which interact within a wider sort of social framework. And we've got to address these barriers head on to equip learners to navigate the epoch. And so in that space, I wanted to highlight again the importance of challenging misinformation, of the technological optimism that sometimes surrounds some of these concepts, and to think about engagement gaps and the idea of climate quietism as hurdles that we are kind of facing in terms of Anthropocene education. So first, in misinformation being one of the most significant hurdles, misinformation, which can be either deliberate or unintentional, undermines trust in science and evidence-based action. One academic that I spoke to would talk about how the misinformation that might be put forward by climate deniers, perhaps, kind of when we're going for the more deliberate acts, there's very little that we can do to control that through an education space, because as they put it on the slide here, the one who wants to deny what's going on, they'll deny it anyway, and they'll find any other way of saying, that something is a problem in terms of maybe related to the Anthropocene debate on the terminology. So it's going beyond this idea that giving people information will be all that's needed for creating action on climate change, because there will be people who simply won't engage and will be intent on driving forward misinformation related to that. And so that's one element of it. But then the other element of it is that the learners who come into our classrooms or into our community spaces are indeed operating within their wider social structures, and so may come feeling skeptical about climate change or influenced by misinformation online. And so when trust in data itself, in science, is eroded, building a foundation for learning and collaboration becomes much more challenging for us. And so to address that, we really need to think about critical thinking in education, not just about teaching the facts to equip learners better to evaluate sources, identify biases, and question narratives. But that's particularly important in an era of evolving kind of AI tools that can produce highly convincing falsehoods. The second area that I wanted to touch on this slide was to think about the tension between kind of technological optimism and humility. So on one hand, the Anthropocene encourages innovative thinking around clean energy and carbon capture and geoengineering solutions, in that if we are at the center of everything as humans, we also have the power to address the challenges, is something that interviewees explored with me. But that needs to be balanced with humility, because there could be something of a false sense of control there, as though we can engineer our way out of the crisis. So the concept of the Anthropocene, as an interview said that it gives them, the tech optimists, a sense that we're in more control than we actually are. And so we have to be kind of careful with using this concept, that's not something that people start to entertain. And so as educators, we've got to strike a balance, encouraging kind of this idea of action, whilst also fostering a sense of humility to recognize humanity's limits and interdependence within natural systems. The third area that I really want to focus on is the idea of the engagement gap. So many communities are excluded from participating in so-called sustainability programs, and that can be particularly affecting marginalized groups, people from low-income communities. They can often be disproportionately affected by the challenges of the Anthropocene, but are unrepresented in terms of engagements around climate action or climate education. And so education systems need to think about how they can become more inclusive of diverse voices and stories so that these communities feel heard and seen in those contexts and that people's needs can be met. And then the final aspect of thinking about challenges is this idea that Bruno Latour talks about climate quietism. So that's the kind of apathy or paralysis that may come when presented with the scale of the problems. So teachers often talk to me about the need, the feeling of overwhelm that students have, that the problem is maybe too big to solve, and so they then just disengaged. And students and teachers worry about this, or worry about the pressures on mental health that can be posed by bringing these things into the classroom. So overall, that means a kind of reframing of the Anthropocene as a crisis, but also an opportunity for hope and action as being key to the pedagogy. Here, again, something that Paolo Freire talked about was the idea of pedagogies of hope by focusing on what individuals and communities can actively do together to shift a narrative then from one of fear to one of empowerment. So each of these challenges here, thinking about misinformation, tech optimism, engagement gaps, and climate quietism, they all undermine our ability to address the Anthropocene effectively. However, if we can build an education system that fosters the trust and inclusivity and action that could be possible through an eco-pedagogic framework, then we get somewhere towards creating solutions. So in terms of thinking about this, of what it means to go beyond this idea of just understanding crisis, but about seizing opportunities for transformative learning. So the key things that I've highlighted in the talk so far is the importance of critical thinking and humility to counter misinformation and oversimplification. The importance of thinking about participatory learning is creating spaces for what might be called empathy-driven education, shifting from guilt and making people feel as though, they're not doing the right things, but to focus on what can be done through real world projects or real world things that they can do, and crucially as a community. So it's both giving a people sense of an agency, but not that the whole responsibility and weight of the issues lies on their shoulders. I've also talked about building trust in terms of another critical opportunity that education must foster trust within communities and between educators, learners, and broader society. And that happens through sustaining dialogue and collaborative projects over time that enable collective action. And then in terms of experiential and creative methods can be incredibly powerful tools for engaging learners emotionally. So it's not just about, as I've said, it's about the knowledge sharing, but it's also about tangible and personal emotional connections that create a critical foundation for learning and action. And so through all these kind of approaches combined, eco-pedagogy can transform the challenges of the Anthropocene into opportunities for empowerment, for a different kind of social contract in that sense. And we can prepare learners to navigate and respond to the epoch with resilience and hope for fostering critical thinking and participatory engagement. Now, I just wanted to, just before I come to my final slide, to show an example of how I'm trying to put some of this into practice. So eco-pedagogy, as I've said, is more than a framework. It's a call for action, for planetary justice and thinking about interconnections. And the Anthropocene, the urgency of it, we also need to think about navigating learners with the tools that are needed to think about transformation in our time. So eco-pedagogy absolutely thrives when it connects theory to action, and participatory learning is central to that. So, in a project that I'm working on in Glasgow called Gallant, which is about taking a living laboratory approach to the city, we're looking at taking community science as a central approach to think about how we address Anthropocene challenges. We've got projects that are about flooding and tree monitoring, composting, as you can see the people here. So looking at composting in local community gardens, in backcourt spaces behind tenements, and analysing the soil to understand just how important soil is and how much life there is in our compost, and really to create that transformation in terms of what's possible in a city space for local people who aren't involved in science traditionally. And that has been something that we've intentionally focused on going over some of those barriers that I confronted, some of those challenges. So we've been able to, for example, pay people a real living wage for participating in the projects as part of the funding, thinking about how we advertise the project differently so that we would get people beyond the kind of usual suspects of participation, and things like this really worked. So thinking about how we overcame the barriers to participation in an active way. So the kind of approach that we're taking here captures the heart of eco-pedagogy, teaching learners to see their role within this interconnected system. And the projects aren't just kind of about learning, but they're about collaboration. They're about linking to other people in your local community, but also with scientists, with the university itself. And so through that process, we're really challenging the University of Glasgow to think about active ways in which being a civic university can be enacted, not just through people coming in through the doors, but by us going actively out. And these kind of participatory initiatives, they demonstrate the power of eco-pedagogy to connect learners to environmental challenges while fostering resilience and action, and so hopefully inspiring a bit of hope too. So just to finish off then, the Anthropocene challenges us to reimagine education as more than knowledge transfer. And we must model resilience and equip learners to embrace complexity and create hope through action. And through eco-pedagogy, we can foster these things, this systems thinking, plurality, and empathy, to prepare learners to navigate the rupture and the pathways for coexistence that are needed for getting through the Anthropocene. So it's not just about the challenges, but it's about the connections and a collaboration and innovation. And so just to finish off, I want to leave everyone with a question today, which is to think about how can your field, whether it be education, research, or completely unrelated, how could you within that space create a pathway to resilience and cohabitation to take an eco-pedagogic stance? So thank you very much for your time.
And thank you, Ria, for a really stunning talk. It was really pedagogic. We've all thoroughly enjoyed.